Here's the truth most men don't want to hear. A woman doesn't come back because you convinced her. She comes back because you stopped needing her. Rejection isn't always the end. Sometimes it's the moment attraction actually begins, but only if you respond the right way. Scarcity rebuilds attraction because human attention naturally moves toward what feels limited, uncertain, or no longer guaranteed. When someone knows they can access you anytime with no resistance or boundaries, your presence becomes predictable. Predictability, over time, reduces emotional intensity. It removes the sense of discovery, challenge, and anticipation that attraction feeds on. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They believe that giving more time, more attention, and more availability will strengthen the connection. In reality, it often does the opposite. When your energy is constantly accessible, it loses weight. Your messages feel expected, your presence feels routine, and your absence becomes irrelevant because it rarely exists. Attraction, at its core, is not just about how someone feels when you're there, it's also about how they feel when you're not. Scarcity shifts that dynamic by reintroducing emotional space. When you are no longer always available, the other person is forced to experience a gap where your presence used to be. That gap creates awareness. Suddenly, your attention is no longer something they can take for granted. They start to notice the silence, the delay, the lack of immediate response. And with that awareness comes a subtle psychological shift. They begin to assign more value to what is no longer constant. This isn't manipulation, it's a reflection of how perception works. People often don't consciously decide to value something less. It happens gradually through repeated exposure without contrast. Scarcity reintroduces that contrast. It reminds them indirectly that your time and energy are not unlimited resources. There's also a deeper layer to this. Scarcity signals self respect. When you are not always available, it communicates that your life is full, that your time is structured, and that your priorities extend beyond one person. This creates a different kind of attraction, one rooted in perceived stability and independence. It shows that you are not organizing your world around someone else's attention. Instead, you are choosing where your attention goes. That distinction matters. When someone senses that your availability is selective rather than automatic, they begin to see you differently. You are no longer just someone who gives, you are someone who chooses. And being chosen carries more emotional weight than being constantly offered. Scarcity also disrupts emotional complacency. When everything is consistent and easily accessible, people stop engaging at a deeper level because there is no urgency to do so. But when access becomes limited, even slightly, it activates a natural response to re engage. The mind starts asking questions. Why has this changed? What are they doing differently? Am I losing their attention? These questions create mental focus, and focus strengthens emotional involvement. The more someone thinks about you, the more space you occupy in their mind, and that increased mental presence often translates into renewed attraction. It's not about playing games or creating artificial distance. It's about understanding that constant availability removes the very tension that attraction depends on. Emotional certainty kills desire because attraction thrives on tension, not predictability. When someone feels completely certain about your availability, your feelings, and your presence in their life, the emotional experience begins to flatten. There's no longer a need to wonder, to interpret, or to invest energy into understanding where they stand with you. While stability and trust are essential for long term connection, early stage attraction and emotional intensity are driven by a degree of uncertainty. This doesn't mean confusion or inconsistency. It means there's still space for curiosity. When that curiosity disappears, desire often fades with it. The moment someone feels they have you fully figured out, fully secured, and fully predictable, the emotional stimulation that once made the connection exciting starts to decline. This is where many people unintentionally weaken attraction. They try to eliminate all doubt by over explaining their feelings, over communicating their intentions, and constantly reassuring the other person of their interest. On the surface, it seems logical. Clarity should strengthen connection. But attraction doesn't operate purely on logic, it operates on emotional engagement. When everything is clearly defined and consistently confirmed, there's no emotional work left for the other person to do. They don't have to think about you, question your behavior, or wonder how you feel. And without that mental and emotional engagement, their investment naturally decreases. Desire isn't just about being liked, it's about being thought about, anticipated, and sometimes even slightly questioned. Emotional certainty also shifts the power dynamic in subtle ways. When one person becomes completely predictable and available, it often places them in a position where they are giving more than they are receiving. This imbalance doesn't just affect behavior, it affects perception. The person who feels certain of your presence may begin to subconsciously value it less, not out of disrespect, but because the human mind tends to prioritize what feels uncertain or at risk. When there's no perceived risk of losing you, there's less urgency to maintain the connection. This is why someone can pull away even when you're doing everything right. It's not about effort, it's about how that effort is perceived when it becomes constant and expected. There's also a psychological comfort that comes with certainty, but comfort and desire are not the same thing. Comfort stabilizes a connection, but desire energizes it. When emotional certainty becomes too strong, it replaces anticipation with routine. The interactions start to feel familiar in a way that lacks excitement. The person no longer experiences the subtle emotional spikes that come from not fully knowing what to expect. This doesn't mean you should create confusion or act unpredictably for the sake of it, but it does mean that maintaining your own independence, your own pace, and your own emotional boundaries keeps the dynamic alive. It ensures that your presence remains something that is experienced, not assumed, and that distinction plays a significant role in sustaining attraction over time. People respect what they can lose because perceived value is closely tied to the possibility of absence. When something or someone feels guaranteed, the mind stops actively evaluating its importance. It becomes part of the background rather than something consciously appreciated. In relationships, this often shows up when one person is consistently available, consistently forgiving, and consistently present regardless of how they are treated. Over time, that consistency, while well intentioned, removes the sense of consequence. If there is no risk of losing you, there is no pressure to maintain a certain level of behavior, effort, or respect. This doesn't mean people deliberately choose to devalue others. It happens subtly through patterns. When your presence feels permanent no matter what, it stops being something that needs to be protected. This is where boundaries and the willingness to walk away become critical. Respect is not created through words or explanations. It is created through actions that show you have limits. When someone knows at a deep level that certain behaviors will result in losing access to you, their perception changes. They begin to see you as someone with standards rather than someone who adapts to any situation just to keep the connection. This shift is powerful because it moves you out of a passive role and into a position of choice. You are no longer trying to be accepted, you are deciding what you will and will not accept. That difference reshapes how the other person engages with you. They become more aware of their actions, more conscious of crossing lines, and more invested in maintaining the connection because it is no longer unconditional in the way they assumed. There's also a psychological tension created when loss becomes a real possibility. Humans are naturally wired to avoid loss more strongly than they seek gain. When someone feels they might lose your attention, your presence, or your interest, it activates a different level of emotional awareness. They begin to notice what they previously overlooked. Your absence carries more weight than your presence once did because it introduces contrast. What was once normal now feels missing, and that absence forces reflection. They start to evaluate what you brought into their life, how you made them feel, and whether they took it for granted. This internal process often leads to a renewed sense of appreciation, but that appreciation only exists because there is now something at risk. At the same time, the willingness to walk away signals a strong sense of self worth. It communicates, without needing to say it, that your value is not dependent on one person's approval or presence. When you are prepared to leave a situation that does not meet your standards, it shows that you prioritize your own well being over maintaining a connection at any cost. This kind of self respect is inherently attractive because it reflects emotional stability and independence. It creates a dynamic where you are not controlled by fear of loss. Instead, you are guided by your own values. That mindset changes how others see you. You are no longer someone who can be taken for granted. You are someone whose presence must be earned and maintained through mutual respect and consistent behavior. Detachment signals strength because it reflects emotional control rather than emotional dependence. When you are detached, you are not driven by the need for constant validation, attention, or reassurance from another person. Your mood, your focus, and your sense of direction are not dictated by how someone responds to you. This creates a very different kind of presence, one that feels grounded, stable, and self contained. Most people are used to dealing with reactions. They expect chasing when they pull away, over explaining when there's tension, and emotional responses when things feel uncertain. Detachment breaks that pattern. It removes the predictable reactions that people rely on to feel in control of the dynamic. And when those reactions disappear, it forces a shift in how they perceive you. Instead of seeing someone who is emotionally dependent, they see someone who is composed and internally secure. This kind of emotional independence is often misunderstood. Detachment does not mean indifference, coldness, or lack of interest. It means your interest is not rooted in need. You can care about someone without losing your sense of self. You can engage without overinvesting. You can step back without feeling like you are losing something essential. That balance is what makes detachment powerful. It communicates that your life is not centered around one person's presence or absence. You are participating in the connection, but you are not defined by it. This removes pressure from the interaction and replaces it with a sense of calm control. When someone feels that you are not trying to hold on to them, it creates a different kind of tension, one where they begin to question their own position rather than you questioning yours. There is also a strong link between detachment and perceived value. People tend to associate emotional stability with strength and desirability. When you are not easily affected by shifts in attention or behavior, it suggests that you have options, priorities, and a life that extends beyond the current interaction. This perception matters because attraction is influenced by how someone imagines your world outside of them. If your world appears small and centered around them, your value decreases. If your world appears full and independent, your value increases. Detachment reinforces the idea that your time and energy are selective. You are not giving them away freely, you are choosing where they go. That choice introduces a level of exclusivity, and exclusivity naturally increases interest. Detachment also protects you from overreacting in moments that would otherwise weaken your position. When someone pulls back, delays communication, or behaves inconsistently, the natural impulse is to respond emotionally by chasing, questioning, or trying to fix the situation immediately. Detachment interrupts that impulse. It allows you to observe rather than react, to assess rather than assume, and to respond with intention rather than emotion. This level of control changes the entire dynamic. Instead of reinforcing imbalance, you maintain your position. Instead of trying to regain attention, you allow space to reveal the other person's true level of interest. And in that space, your strength becomes visible, not through words, but through the absence of need driven behavior. Memory edits reality because people do not remember experiences exactly as they happened. They remember how those experiences made them feel, and even those feelings are reshaped over time. When a relationship ends or someone pulls away, the immediate emotions are often influenced by tension, misunderstandings, or unmet expectations. In that moment, the negative aspects feel stronger and more present, which can justify distance or rejection. But as time passes and emotional intensity fades, the mind begins to filter those memories differently. It softens the sharp edges of conflict and reduces the weight of negative emotions. What remains more accessible are the moments that felt good, the connection, the attention, the way you made them feel when things were aligned. This is not a conscious decision. It is a natural psychological process where the brain prioritizes emotionally meaningful highlights over detailed accuracy. Distance plays a critical role in this shift. When someone is no longer interacting with you daily, they are no longer experiencing the small frictions that may have contributed to the initial loss of attraction. There are no ongoing disagreements, no over-analysis of messages, no immediate triggers that reinforce negative feelings. Instead, their perception of you becomes more abstract, shaped by selective recall rather than real-time interaction. In this space, the mind often fills gaps with idealized versions of past experiences. It reconstructs the connection in a way that feels cleaner, simpler, and more appealing than it may have actually been. This is why someone who once focused on your flaws can later remember your strengths more vividly. The absence of current interaction removes the context that once amplified those flaws. There is also a tendency for people to reassess past decisions when the emotional environment changes. When someone rejects you, they are making that decision based on how they feel in that specific moment. But feelings are not fixed, they shift depending on circumstances, personal growth, and new experiences. As their internal state changes, so does the way they interpret past events. They may begin to question whether they judged the situation too quickly or whether they overlooked certain qualities. This reevaluation is often influenced by comparison as well. If they encounter new people or situations that do not provide the same emotional experience, it can make past connections seem more valuable in hindsight. The mind starts to contrast what is missing now with what was present before, and that contrast can elevate your perceived value. Another important factor is the way memory simplifies complexity. Real interactions are layered. They include both positive and negative elements happening simultaneously, but memory tends to separate these elements over time, allowing one side to become more dominant. If the overall emotional impact of the connection was positive, those positive impressions are more likely to resurface once the negative intensity fades. This doesn't mean the past is being remembered accurately. It means it is being remembered selectively. The result is a version of you that exists more in feeling than in fact. You become associated with a certain emotional tone rather than a detailed recollection of every interaction, and that emotional association can be powerful enough to reignite curiosity or renewed interest. This process also explains why chasing or trying to immediately change someone's perception after rejection often backfires. When you stay present and continue to push for attention, you keep the negative emotional context alive. You don't allow space for memory to soften or for perception to reset. But when you step back and remove yourself from constant interaction, you give time the opportunity to do what it naturally does: reshape emotional memory. In that absence, the intensity of past frustrations decreases and the emotional highlights gain more prominence. The person is no longer reacting to who you are in the moment, they are responding to how they remember you, and that remembered version is often more favorable than the reality they experienced at the time. Unfinished emotional experiences pull people back because the human mind is wired to seek closure. When something begins but doesn't reach a clear emotional resolution, it creates a kind of internal tension that doesn't easily fade. This is often described in psychology as the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency to remember incomplete experiences more vividly than completed ones. In relationships, this shows up when there was clear attraction, curiosity, or emotional connection, but it was interrupted before it fully developed or naturally declined. The interaction ends, but the emotional process doesn't. Instead of feeling resolved, the experience lingers in the background of the mind, creating a subtle sense that something is still open, still undefined, and still worth revisiting. This lack of closure keeps the emotional loop active. When someone walks away from a situation that still had potential, their mind continues to process it, often replaying moments and imagining alternative outcomes. They might think about what could have happened if things progressed differently, or how the dynamic might feel under different circumstances. This is not always conscious. It can show up as random thoughts, brief flashes of memory, or a quiet curiosity that never fully disappears. The more emotionally engaging the initial interaction was, the stronger this effect becomes. If there was chemistry, tension, or a sense of something meaningful starting to form, the brain registers that as an incomplete experience. And incomplete experiences naturally demand attention because they lack a defined ending. Another important layer is how uncertainty amplifies emotional investment. When everything is clearly defined, when someone knows exactly how a relationship began, developed, and ended, there is less room for interpretation. But when the experience is cut short or left ambiguous, it creates space for imagination. The mind fills in gaps with possibilities rather than facts. This often leads to idealization, where the person reconstructs the experience in a more appealing way than it may have actually been. They focus on the potential rather than the reality. This imagined version can feel compelling because it is not limited by real world constraints. It exists in a space where everything that could have gone right still feels possible, and that possibility can be more emotionally engaging than a fully experienced and concluded interaction. Unfinished experiences also create a subtle sense of emotional ownership. When someone invests attention, curiosity, or attraction into another person but doesn't reach a clear outcome, it can feel like something was left unresolved on their side. This can lead to a desire to re engage, not necessarily because of deep attachment, but because of the need to complete what was started. They may want to see if their initial feelings were valid, if the connection could have developed further, or if the outcome would be different the next time. This pull is not always logical. It's driven by the mind's preference for completion over ambiguity. The more open ended the experience, the stronger the urge to close that loop. This is why stepping back instead of forcing continuation can have a powerful effect. When you try to push for answers, clarity, or progression too quickly, you often force the experience into an artificial conclusion, which removes the very tension that creates emotional pull. But when the interaction ends naturally, without full resolution, it leaves behind a psychological imprint that remains active. The other person is not just remembering what happened, they are responding to what didn't happen, to what was left unexplored. That gap between reality and possibility becomes the source of ongoing interest. And in many cases, it's what brings them back to see if the story can continue in a different way. At the end of all this, understand one thing clearly. None of these principles are about making someone come back. They're about making sure you never have to chase anyone who left. When you build real self worth, when you control your emotions, and when you're willing to walk away without hesitation, you shift out of a position of need and into a position of choice. That's where your power is. Because the moment you stop trying to hold on to people is the moment the right ones start holding on to you. Focus on your standards, protect your energy, move with discipline, not emotion. And if someone returns, it's not a victory. The real victory is becoming someone who no longer waits to be chosen.